Hi, welcome to part 6 of the Hat in Time Blue Rift tutorial. In our last tutorial, we built together a level, but it's a little bit boring because nothing's moving. First off, let's start simple and talk about what is Kismet. If we open up Kismet here, you'll see some boxes and some line. Let's Kismet something incredibly simple. As I mentioned at the end of the last tutorial, I put down a checkpoint, but the checkpoint doesn't actually trigger yet. The reason for that is that there is no code that is telling the game to set the checkpoint to that. So we have to use Kismet to do it. There are 3 types of nodes in Kismet. There is an action node, which is the mission intro. Matinee is sort of its own thing, but I'm still going to call it an action node. Then there are event nodes, which are when this thing happens, play this action. And then there are condition nodes, which are if this thing is true, then play action. And then there's variables, but these aren't really going to be that important yet. I'll go over them anyways. Variables are basically numbers that can be assigned to things to check whether or not something has happened. A variable, for example, can be the number of enemies you've defeated, and when that number reaches a certain value, you can make it trigger something. You can use conditions to check variables by using comparison and compare int, which then lets you compare 2 variables to each other. That's a little bit more complicated than we need to get into right now. God, it is hot in here. So what we're going to do is use something called a trigger volume. First, we need to create that. How we can do that is by using something called the builder brush. In order to activate the builder brush, you press B on your keyboard, which will make it visible in the level. This is not actually an object. This is a brush that you can use to place objects. Those objects being BSP, which stands for binary space partitioning. And what that does is it lets you create level geometry without having to import assets. However, it's very janky, and I wouldn't really recommend using it unless you know what you're doing with it and that it benefits the specific things that you need to get done. It's very good for sketching out levels though. Hey, me from the future editing this in post because I forgot to mention something. Say you put down your brush and you push B to unhide it. Where is it? I don't know. I lost it. If you ever lose your builder brush, what you can do is go down to this button and it'll come up with, it's not right now, but it'll come up with a little thing that says go to builder brush. If you click this button, it'll put you over to where your builder brush is. I intentionally moved it way out of bounds so that I could demonstrate this. And if you ever want to change its position without having to move it over, just click on an object and choose like square. And it'll put it there. Very important thing. By default, I think this is disabled, but there is an option up here. You can't see it right now, it's off the screen for whatever reason, but this option is called toggle brush polygons. You're going to want to enable this, because then when you select your brush, you will be able to see it highlighted. This is important because when you move it, you can see it intersect with things. Without that, you have no idea where your brush is. I only learned this like 1,000 hours into the editor. It was very embarrassing. So the other thing you can put down with the builder brush is volumes. Volumes are sets of area that trigger something when the player enters them. They could be water volumes that when the player enters them, they start swimming. They could be lava volumes that damage the player when they enter them. They could be trigger volumes, which trigger events inside of Kismet. So using the same tools, move the builder brush over to the area that you want to cover with the area. For example, we're going to cover this area with a volume that will trigger the checkpoint change. You can move this brush around using the same tools as normal, but what you can also do is click this button up here, Geometry Mode. What this will do is bring up a little window here, and then you can click individual sides of it and then extend it in that direction. For our purposes, however, we don't really need to use this. I'm just telling you so that you know it exists. For our purposes, the default cube looks fine. If you ever mess up the shape of your cube, if you ever mess up the shape of your brush and you just cannot fix it, pressing any of these buttons will put it into a preset shape. This is the cube shape, cone, cylinder, staircase, linear staircase, you know, all this kind of stuff. I really only ever use cube. I don't really use many of these other ones, but they can be useful for some circumstances. So now that our builder brush is in position, we're going to go to this button that says volumes. We're going to click it and it'll bring down a drop-down menu. In this, you can access all of the engine's volumes. We're going to want to go to the Hat in Time Game Content tab, as this is where all of the Hat in Time volumes are stored. These other ones still work, but most of them aren't very useful. Or let me be more specific, they aren't useful to the average mod user. The only one that the average mod user would really want to pay attention to is the cull distance volume, which will make it so that anything inside that volume will be culled out if you're far away enough from it, but you don't need to worry about that right now. Our level isn't that big. So here we're going to go to the Hat in Time volumes and go to Trigger Volume. You might not see it because the builder brush is overlapping, so just press B again to hide the builder brush. As you can see, we now have a volume here where our builder brush was. You can open the properties, but there aren't really that many properties that you need to edit on a trigger volume. Once you have it selected, what you can do is then go into Kismet, right click, and now you will see New Event using Hat Trigger Volume 0. Anytime you click any object in the editor, if you go into Kismet, you can then put that thing in as an event or an object. Object is something that it gets targeted. For example, say you want a door to hide when you leave an area or something. So we're going to use New Event using Hat Trigger Volume 0. These all do different things, but the only thing we really need to worry about for a trigger volume is on touch. So what this event does is when it is touched, it will do something. There's also a node for when you leave the volume, but we don't really need that. So first, you're going to go to New Action, Set Variable, Set Checkpoint. Hi, me from the future again, here to tell you that when you're scrolling through these actions, this can be a little bit obnoxious to find something, but if you know what node you want, say, I want a conversation tree, what you would do is go to this light bulb icon up here. Click that, and then you can type in the name of the object. This will save you a lot of time and save you a lot of menuing. The target needs to be what the thing will be targeting, and this will be targeting the player. In order to target the player, right-click, go to New Variable, and then choose Player, Player. This will make it so that it will target all players. In order to connect this, we drag the line to the node, and then we drag this to the event. So now, when the trigger volume is touched, Set Checkpoint will be triggered. Right now, it is set to checkpoint 1. We don't need to change this because that's the checkpoint we are setting to. There are some values here that you might want to change depending on your circumstances. Show notification makes it so that it pops up with a little indicator that says checkpoint. Sometimes you don't want this. Sometimes you want the checkpoint to be invisible. Only highest means that this checkpoint will only trigger if it's higher than all of the other checkpoints that you've gotten. What this does is that if you are late into the level and then land back down here, it will not reset your checkpoint back to this. But sometimes you might want that. It depends on the level. Sync for Online Party makes it so that everybody gets that checkpoint. That's kind of how a lot of stuff in the editor works. There is a lot of variables that you can change, but most of them aren't that important, but they can be depending on the kind of level you're making. So that's the reason that I go over all of these, just so that you know what they do, so that if you need that functionality, you can use it. This is all we needed to do. Now, when we touch the trigger volume, it will set our checkpoint to 1, which is this. So let's test it. And with that, it works. So now that we've done that, we're going to want to make some of these objects move so that we can make our level a little bit more interesting. So let's make it so that these platforms move left and right. To do that, we go back into Kismet. And then we're going to go to a new area, hit new event, level loaded. What this means is that when the level starts up, this will be triggered. Loaded and visible is what I use. I don't actually know what these two do. You'll probably figure it out if it's something that you need. Next, we're going to make a new matinee. We'll tie this into play and then double click this. Double clicking the matinee will bring up the matinee editor. This is a nightmare to use if you don't have another monitor. I'm sorry if you're doing this on one monitor, but I'll do my best to demonstrate for the sake of one monitor, people. This green area is what will be played. So at the beginning of every matinee, what you want to do is click on this and drag it to the end. This red tab lets you choose how long the matinee is. 5 seconds should be enough for what we're doing. So let me make that smaller so that I can see the game. Now we're in matinee mode, which will let us move objects. In order to put an object into matinee, you're going to want to select it, and then while it's selected, right click, add new empty group. And then let's call this platform 1. If we go back into Kismet, you'll see that the mesh actor is now added in. However, this actually isn't going to work because the thing that we put in is a static mesh actor. As the name implies, it is static. It cannot move. So how do we make it into something that can be moved? Well, first you'll need to close out a matinee and go over to your cube, right click it, go down to the convert, and then convert static mesh to mover. It'll give you this error if you already tied it in, but don't worry about it, it'll be fine. You'll notice the lighting has changed slightly. I'll go over how lighting works in a second. Now you'll see that it is an interp actor, which is the correct type of actor that we need to use. Now if we open up Matinee again, it will work, but we haven't given it any instructions. First off, we're going to need to right click our platform. And then we're going to go down to the tab that says add new movement track. This will make it so that you can edit the different tabs. This thing can be a lot to take in, but the best thing I can recommend is don't worry about stuff too much right now. Just focus on the things that I talk about in the tutorial. Ignore all this other stuff until you need to know what it does. If it's something that's relevant to this tutorial, I will say so. So to move this thing, we're going to need to make a keyframe. By default, it'll make a keyframe at the start. That's the starting point that the object was in by default. So this is in seconds. 0.5 is half a second, 1.0 is 1 second. This is like a timeline for your movement. So let's say we want it to take 5 seconds to get there. Actually, 5 seconds seems a bit much. Let's say 2.5. We're going to place down, by clicking this button up here, you will add a new keyframe into your timeline. By clicking this keyframe and then moving your object, you will notice a line will be drawn because you're moving the position of that object on that keyframe. Let's play this. You can play Matinee by clicking this play button up here. Seems pretty good, but we want it to move back also. We want it to go back and forth. Now here's what I recommend. You could go all the way over to the 5 second mark and then put down another keyframe and then say move it back into position. This works. Let's play this. That works. That seems fine, right? But if we go into the Matinee again and click this button, which will let us view it in a loop. Let's look at it now. You'll notice, you might not notice it there, but there's I got really lucky with my placement there. But there's a little bit of a slight jitter because it's, by default, it's resetting back to the default position. So instead of doing it like this, what you instead want to do, get rid of these keyframes. Instead, at the 5 second mark, put another keyframe. This will put the keyframe where it is by default, but don't move this keyframe, leave it as is. Now go to the 2.5 second mark, and then move it to the position you want. Now, if we click the loop play to see how this works, you'll notice it's completely seamless now because the start and end points are exactly the same. And this is incredibly useful if your object needs to do a looping action. If the action only needs to happen once, this isn't that important. Now let's add this second platform into place. Now what you could do is actually, instead of going in and making a new matinee, you could grab this object. First, let's convert it to a mover. You could grab this object, right click, and then choose new object using interpret actor, and then tie that into platform 1. This will make it use the same exact matinee data so you don't have to redo it. For my purposes, I'm going to make a new one just because I want that one to have a different pattern slightly. You can have as many matinees in your level as you want, although I would recommend not having a billion of them because that might slow down your level quite a bit. So if you have something that needs to have the exact same movement, you can do it that way. But instead, let's go into the matinee and add a second object. You could also make a second matinee, but why do that when you can compress it into one matinee? There are reasons why you would want to have a separate matinee, but it's a little complicated and it's not that important for this tutorial. So let's add another one, call it platform 2. As we did last time, add a new movement track, and then let's make a similar sort of thing. Go to the 5 second mark, put down a keyframe. Oh yeah, in order to have the keyframe go to the specific one you want, you're going to need to have that track highlighted, which you can change using this. Going to 2.5, let's put down another keyframe, and then we'll move it into place. So let's see what that looks like now. More or less the same than if I just copy and pasted it, but it's fine. Now, let's playtest that. You can see our objects are moving, but they stopped moving. Why is that? Well, if we go back into the Kismet and go to our matinee, there is a little checkbox here that says looping. This is disabled by default. You want to enable this if it's a looping matinee, like this one. Now, you see, it's working, but these might be a little fast. I'm saying this for the purpose of the tutorial, they're not actually that fast. But say you want to change the speed of them. Say let's make them a little bit slower. Play rate is where you do that. It's at 1.0, that's the default. If we set that to 0.9, it will be slightly slower. 0.9 is 90% full speed. As such, you can also do it in the other direction. If I set it to 2, it'll be 2 times as fast, or 200% speed. Let's jump on these and try to get through. Oh no, we fell through the platform. That's not great. Why did that happen? Well, for whatever reason, when you convert an object into a mover, by default it will remove its collision. In order to fix this, click on that object, go into the properties using F4, go down to the collision tab, and this thing that says collision type, no collision, you're going to want to change this to block all. That will put the collision back. Now, I'm also going to do it on this one, but what you could do to make it so both of them have that, you can just select both of them by holding Control to select multiple things. When you're holding Control, clicking on another object will then add it to that. Oh, and if you, just a random, completely unrelated tidbit, if you want to undo something, it's the same as pretty much any other program. You use Control-Z. So for this, we'll go down to collision, set it to block all. Now both of them are set to block all. Let's try it. That's a fun little puzzle. You gotta sort of time it because they're synced together. And with that, I've gone over the basics of Matinee and Kismet. You can use this to get a general idea of what you want to do. but I'm gonna go over one more thing with Matinee because it is a nightmare, and I don't know why it's this bad, but I'm not actually gonna put this into the level, but let's say I wanna make something looping rotating. So let's take this object, convert it into a mover, then we're gonna go into our thing, make a new Matinee, making a new Matinee just for organization's sake so that it's not all in one place. Sometimes it's good to keep stuff separately. What you can also do to access your Matinee is go up to this tab, which opens up Unreal Matinee, and let you choose things. Unfortunately, they're all named, 1, 0, 2, which is a little hard to keep track. So let's say you want to keep track of which one's which. Click on your Matinee, scroll down to Sequence Object, see Object Comment, type in whatever you want to call it so that you have an idea of what it's called, then do that again for the other one. This will label them in Kismet, and I would recommend that you label a lot of things in Kismet, because if you don't, you will lose track of what does what, and it will slow down your workflow quite a bit. I don't want to comment these individual nodes, so what I can instead do is put down a new comment. Let's say this is sets the checkpoint to checkpoint 1. This is a little bit, obvious, but I would recommend that you comment up your Kismet as much as possible so that you have an easy reference for what does what. This is important for your own sanity, and this is very important if you're going to have other people work on your levels. Because if other people look at your Kismet and they just see a giant spaghetti pile, they're not going to know what the heck anything does. So try to comment your Kismet up as much as possible. So when you put an object tag onto the Matinee, then when you go to the Matinee thing, you'll notice that they are now labeled. This is very useful, and I recommend doing it. Anyways, back to the spinning block thing. So as usual, we select it, click make a new update group, spinning block. Then we're going to right click it, make a new movement track. Do the same thing, put it together. So the reason I'm bringing this up is just because I have a lot of trouble with this. So say you want this to rotate. So you have the start and end position. So you rotate it at 2.5 seconds, 180 degrees. Let's see what that looks like. That is not what I expected it to do. I am very confused. The main point I was going to make with this is that rotation can be a little bit weird in Matinee. I have no clue why it did that. That was not what I was going to demonstrate. Okay, so I really do not understand why it's doing this, but this actually works in my favor because now I can demonstrate what to do when your Matinee is acting really strangely. The computer tries to calculate the best path to get over there, and sometimes that path is really far from what you actually want the object to do. So instead what you're going to do, put that object down, and then you're going to right click on the movement track and click Split Translation and Rotation. This lets you make keyframes for individual axes. This is very helpful because sometimes you need more precise control over your objects if they're not behaving the way you want them to. If you ever forget what axis is which, you can look at the bottom left of the screen where you can tell. So the red one is X. For moving objects it should be fine, but when you try to rotate anything, it is a nightmare. It is just a nightmare to do. What you can do when you split the axes like these is you can right click and then set value. So now we see it set the value to 4,000 degrees. I don't know why it did this, but it did. You would not have known this with the default one, so instead what you can do is now set this to 180. I accidentally put a thing in there, so it didn't work. It has to be a number. 180. Now if we go back to our thing, now it works as intended. But you'll notice that it goes back in the opposite direction. So what's the deal here? It sets it back to 0, so for whatever reason it decides to reverse whatever you did. So what you want to do is See how this was typed as 180? Type 180 again. Then it will spin 180 in that direction. Except it didn't. Alright, I forgot. 180 is not additive. That's not turn 180 degrees, that's turn to 180 degrees. So instead, we want to turn this to 360. So look at this. Now it spins as intentional. But you'll notice now, also you can click this drop down menu to fix to make it so that it's not split. So now you'll notice there's a little bit of a weird easing. It's because we're using curve keyframes, which will make it so that it eases in and out. It looks really nice, but sometimes you don't want it. Like for example, this, you just want a smooth turning. So to fix that, you can you go to this drop-down tab, go to linear, and that will make it so that every keyframe you add is a linear keyframe, not an easing keyframe. To edit existing ones, you right-click them, you right-click them, you right-click them. I'm leaving this frustration in the video just to let you know this editor is a little frustrating sometimes. You have to bear with it. It's not really something. Like, it's inevitable. This editor is going to frustrate you. It's kind of a nightmare sometimes. Don't worry. But don't get too frustrated over it. It's not that big of a deal. And if you just don't let yourself get frustrated over it, you'll be good. However, if you are having issues, you can ask the Hat in Time Discord for some help. There's a modding help channel that will give you assistance with your modding thing. So if you ever have a very specific question that you can't look up, just go to the modding help section and ask there. The community is very helpful. They're sometimes a little slow to respond because of time zones, but if somebody knows the answer to your question, they will probably answer it. So now, right-click your keyframe, set linear, set this one to linear. We don't need to set the other ones to linear because we didn't change them. So now if we go into the thing, you'll notice, loop this, now it's seamlessly rotating. You'll notice there's a little bit of a seam with the gizmo, but ignore that. That won't be visible in-game. So if we set this to looping, and then play from here, we will see our object is now rotating. That turned into a side tangent where I talked about the editor being a little bit obnoxious sometimes. And yeah, it's a little bit obnoxious sometimes. You have to deal with it. But if you don't let it get to you, it'll be just fine. I'll make these other things move, and then we'll continue. Because you know what else would make this level more interesting? If we could place down some enemies, or maybe some fire bars or something, or maybe put down some hook shots that you can swing from. In the next tutorial, I'll be talking about placing down what are called actors, which are objects that can be interacted with.